HOA built 139 vacation cabins on my lake, so I dropped the dam gates and let nature handle the rest. The peaceful mornings on the lake were once the best part of life. The stillness of the water, the sound of birds singing, and the fresh smell of nature, everything felt just right. It was a place of quiet where the protagonist could relax and escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life. For years, this little patch of land and the beautiful lake had been theirs to enjoy. They had a deep connection with the land, watching the seasons change and the wildlife come and go. The lake was like a friend, always steady, always calm. This was their sanctuary, the place where they could think clearly, reflect on the past, and dream of the future. They spent long afternoons on the porch, watching the sunlight dance on the water's surface or walking the shoreline, feeling the cool breeze against their skin. The lake wasn't just water, it was a part of who they were, a source of peace that they had worked hard to protect. The protagonist had always believed that nature should be preserved, and the lake had always served as a reminder of that belief. It was a quiet place, far from the crowds, with no noise from traffic or construction. That is, until the day the news arrived. A letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, landed in the mailbox, addressed to all the property owners near the lake. The HOA, an organization the protagonist had always trusted to maintain the peace and integrity of the neighborhood, was now planning a big development. In the letter, they explained that they would be building 139 vacation cabins around the lake. The protagonist felt a chill run through them as they read the words. The development sounded harmless at first. The letter promised that the cabins would be tastefully designed and in harmony with the natural surroundings. The HOA assured everyone that there would be no disruption to the lake's environment. They even said the project would create jobs, attract tourists, and improve the overall value of the area. It seemed like a win-win situation, at least on paper, but something didn't sit right with the protagonist. They couldn't shake the feeling that the promise of tasteful design was just a cover for what might be something far worse. Over the next few weeks, the protagonist couldn't stop thinking about it. The more they thought, the more they realized how much the lake meant to them. It wasn't just a pretty sight. It was part of the landscape, a natural treasure that had been untouched for years. The idea of cabins being built so close to the shore, with roads and parking lots for tourists, seemed like an intrusion. It would change the very essence of the place. The peaceful lake that had been their retreat would soon be surrounded by the noise of construction and the hustle of vacationers. Despite their concerns, the protagonist decided to attend the next HOA meeting. They hoped that maybe there was more to the plan that they didn't understand. The meeting was held at the community center, a small building in the heart of the neighborhood. When the protagonist arrived, they were surprised to find that the room was filled with people who were all in favor of the development. The HOA members stood at the front, explaining the benefits of the new cabins. They spoke about how the cabins would provide more recreational opportunities and bring in revenue for the area. They even mentioned that the cabins would be built with eco-friendly materials, promising to minimize their impact on the environment. As the meeting went on, the protagonist felt a growing sense of unease. The more the HOA spoke, the more they realized that the project wasn't really about preserving nature, it was about making money. The cabins would be built close to the water's edge, with large parking areas for guests. The small nature trails would be widened to accommodate more foot traffic, and the peaceful atmosphere would be replaced with the noise of cars and tourists. The protagonist raised their concerns during the meeting, but their words were met with polite nods and a few dismissive glances. The HOA assured them that everything would be carefully planned and that the cabins would not disturb the lake. But the protagonist wasn't convinced. After the meeting, the protagonist took a long walk along the shoreline. The lake looked the same as it always had, calm and peaceful, the water gently rippling as the wind blew across it. But in the back of their mind, they couldn't stop thinking about what was coming. The trees that lined the shore, the quiet corners of the lake where animals came to drink, and the solitude they had enjoyed for so long, it all felt threatened now. The idea of hundreds of people coming to stay in those cabins, driving their cars around the lake, leaving trash behind, and cutting down more trees for new roads was something they couldn't bear. The protagonists spent the next few days talking to their neighbors. Some of them were excited about the new cabins, seeing them as a way to bring more attention and visitors to the area. Others, like the protagonist, were more concerned about the environmental impact. Some residents who had been here for decades expressed worry that the development would disrupt the peaceful life they had built. Despite the growing tension, the HOA moved forward with its plans. They sent out more letters, cleared the land, and soon enough, construction began. The protagonist watched as the workers arrived with their heavy equipment. The sound of bulldozers and excavators replaced the quiet of the lake, and the once peaceful atmosphere was shattered. Trees were cleared, and the shoreline was being changed. The protagonist knew that the damage had already begun. But as the days passed, the protagonist became more determined to stop it. They tried talking to the HOA again, but their concerns were still dismissed. The project was already too far along, and the promises of preserving the environment were quickly forgotten. It was clear now that the protagonist's peaceful retreat would never be the same again. The lake that had been a sanctuary, a place of calm, was being transformed into a commercial destination. And that was when the protagonist made the decision that would change everything. They would no longer sit by and watch as the land they loved was destroyed. They had to act. The construction of the vacation cabins was now in full swing. Each morning, as the protagonist woke up and looked out over the lake, they could see the heavy machinery moving around the shoreline. The once quiet place that had offered them peace and tranquility now felt like a battlefield. The sound of bulldozers, chainsaws, and trucks replaced the soothing sounds of birds and wind. The construction workers were everywhere, cutting down trees, digging up the earth, and slowly but surely transforming the area into what the HOA had promised, a commercial vacation spot. At first, the protagonist tried to ignore the noise, telling themselves that they could adjust to the changes. After all, the cabins would be built on the other side of the lake, far away from their own property. But as the weeks went by, they began to realize that the changes were much closer than they had been told. The cabins were not just being built in the distance. Roads were being constructed around the lake, some of which ran right next to the water, disturbing the peaceful shoreline. The pristine forest that surrounded the lake was being cleared to make way for parking lots, walking paths, and more cabins. The protagonist couldn't stand to watch it happen any longer. They began to question how the HOA could have promised to protect the lake while still pushing forward with such a massive development project. Every promise made by the HOA seemed to be falling apart. The cabins were not tastefully designed, as they had claimed. Instead, they were big, boxy buildings that looked completely out of place. And what about the harmony with nature they had promised? The rows of concrete roads and parking spaces were far from natural, and the once lush greenery was being replaced with construction materials and machinery. The protagonist tried reaching out to the HOA again, this time attending a special meeting that was called to update the community on the progress of the project. They had hoped that maybe, just maybe, the HOA would listen to the concerns of the residents who were against the development. But as they walked into the meeting, it was clear that the HOA had no intention of backing down. The members of the HOA stood at the front, discussing the progress of the cabins and boasting about how successful the project was going to be. They spoke excitedly about the future of the area, mentioning the tourists who would soon flock to the cabins, the revenue it would generate, and the new jobs it would bring. It was all about money, and the protagonist could see that clearly now. When the protagonist stood up to speak, their voice shook with frustration. They asked the HOA members how they could justify destroying such a beautiful, natural place in the name of progress. They asked how they could pretend that this development was in harmony with nature when every tree that was felled and every rock that was moved was ruining the environment. But the HOA's response was the same as it had been before. They were doing what was best for the community. They promised that the cabins would bring economic growth, jobs, and prosperity. They even mentioned the eco-friendly materials being used, but the protagonist knew these promises were hollow. They had seen the construction sites up close. The earth was being dug up, the trees were being cleared, and none of it felt sustainable. After the meeting, the protagonist felt even more disillusioned than before. The HOA seemed so focused on their plans for growth that they were blind to the damage they were causing. The protagonist felt helpless, stuck between the destruction of the land they loved and the community that seemed determined to push forward with the cabins no matter the cost. It felt like they were fighting a losing battle, but they couldn't give up. The lake was too important to them. The days turned into weeks and the construction continued. As the cabins began to take shape, the protagonist's sense of anger and helplessness grew. Each day, they saw more of the lake's beauty fade away. The once clear, sparkling water was now clouded by the runoff from the construction. The fish and other wildlife that had once thrived in the lake seemed to disappear. The trees that had once stood tall and proud along the shoreline were now stumps, and the birds that had flown through the area were nowhere to be found. The protagonist's mind raced as they thought about what to do. They had already tried reasoning with the HOA, but their words had fallen on deaf ears. They had attended meetings, voiced their concerns, and yet nothing had changed. The cabins were still being built, and the environment was being destroyed piece by piece. The more the protagonists thought about it, the more they realized that the only way to stop this was to take matters into their own hands. One evening, as they sat by the lake, the protagonist watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting a golden light across the water. The serenity of the scene was almost unbearable now. How could anyone look at this place and think it was okay to destroy it for a few vacation cabins? The protagonist knew that they couldn't sit by any longer. They had to do something, but what? It was then that the idea came to them. They had always known about the dam that controlled the flow of water from the lake. It was a small dam, but it held back a significant amount of water, keeping the lake at a steady level. The protagonist had always believed that the dam was a safeguard, a way to protect the lake from flooding. But now, it seemed like it could be the tool they needed to take action. If they could open the dam gates, they could let the water rise, flooding the construction sites and the cabins. The flooding wouldn't just disrupt the development, it would make it impossible to continue building. The cabins would be destroyed and the environment would be saved. The more the protagonist thought about it, the more the idea seemed like the only way to stop the destruction. They knew it was drastic, but what choice did they have? The HOA wasn't listening, and the construction was moving faster than they could keep up with. If they didn't act now, the lake and everything they had worked so hard to protect would be gone. As the days passed, the protagonist prepared for the decision they knew they had to make. They didn't want to cause harm, but they felt like they had no other option. They watched the construction from their porch, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. The lake was their life, and they couldn't let it be destroyed. The decision had been made. The protagonist sat quietly on the porch, staring at the lake as the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the water. It was a moment of peace, but it was also filled with tension. The calmness of the lake seemed like a cruel reminder of what was about to happen. The protagonist could no longer stand by and watch as the construction continued to destroy the land they loved so much. They had to act, and they knew that the consequences of their actions would be far-reaching. For days, they had thought about the dam and the potential damage they could cause by opening the gates. They knew it was risky, but the more they thought about it, the more it seemed like the only solution. The construction crews were making progress faster than the protagonist had anticipated, and it seemed like there was no way to stop them. The only thing they could do was halt the development by flooding the area. The thought of it felt almost unnatural, but the protagonist couldn't see another way. The dam was not particularly large, but it controlled the flow of water from the lake, and its gates had the power to change the water level drastically. The protagonist had always known that the gates could be opened in times of emergency, but they had never considered using them for something like this. The decision weighed heavily on their conscience. Could they really flood the construction sites and destroy everything in their path? Could they risk damaging the lake itself, even if it meant stopping the development? In the end, the protagonist felt they had no choice. The cabins would not only destroy the beauty of the lake, but they would also harm the wildlife that depended on it. The trees, the fish, the birds, everything that had lived in harmony here for generations would be gone if the development continued. The protagonist's heart ached at the thought, but they knew that if they didn't do something now, it would be too late. They would never forgive themselves if they let this go on. The night before the planned action, the protagonists spent hours pacing around their property, thinking about the consequences. They tried to reason with themselves, asking if there was another way. Could they talk to the construction crews? Could they make the HOA understand the damage they were causing? The answer was always the same. No. The HOA had already made up its mind, and the cabins were going to be built whether the protagonist liked it or not. The construction crews were not interested in the concerns of a single property owner. They were only focused on their jobs, and the HOA had ensured that everything was set in motion. As the night grew darker, the protagonist felt a sense of determination wash over them. Tomorrow they would do what they had to do. They had spent enough time feeling helpless, and now it was time to take control. The lake had been their refuge, their sanctuary, and they would fight to protect it, even if it meant sacrificing a part of themselves. The following morning, the protagonist made their way to the dam. It was a simple structure, tucked away behind a thicket of trees. The morning air was cool and crisp, and the lake still reflected the clear blue sky, untouched by the construction chaos that was unfolding on the other side. The protagonist's heart raced as they approached the dam, their thoughts running wild with the enormity of what they were about to do. They stood there for a moment, staring at the gates, and for the first time they felt the weight of their decision. With trembling hands, the protagonist began to open the gates, one click at a time. The water started to flow out slowly at first, but then faster as the gates fully opened. The lake, which had been so still just moments ago, began to shift. The calm water started to rise, and soon the water level was noticeably higher. The protagonist felt a knot form in their stomach as they watched the water begin to flood the construction site. The first few inches of water crept over the freshly laid roads, and the ground started to soften beneath the weight of the rising tide. The heavy equipment, the parking lots, the cabins, all of it would soon be submerged if the water continued to rise. As the minutes ticked by, the protagonist's mind raced. Was this the right decision? Would the water stop in time? What if they caused irreversible damage? The thoughts were overwhelming, but there was no turning back now. The gates were wide open, and the water had begun its inevitable rise. All the protagonist could do was watch. The floodwaters quickly spread across the construction site, flowing into the parking lots, over the roads, and into the foundation of the cabins that had already been built. The sound of the water rushing was deafening. It was as if nature itself was reclaiming what had been taken from it. Trees that had been felled for the cabins were now being swept away by the current. The once dry earth was turning into a muddy, watery mess, and the cabins, still incomplete, were beginning to sink into the ground. The protagonists stood there, frozen, watching the destruction unfold. They felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. The cabins were being destroyed, but at what cost? The water had reached the parking lot, and now the flood was creeping closer to the other cabins that had not yet been completed. The earth was soft, and the foundations of the buildings began to sink into the mud. The protagonist couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization that they had just set in motion something that could not be undone. As the day went on, the water level continued to rise. The construction site, which had once been bustling with workers and equipment, was now a flooded mess. The heavy machinery was stuck in the mud, unable to move as the floodwaters swallowed everything in their path. The cabins that had been built closest to the water were already half submerged, their foundations barely holding. It wasn't just the cabins that were being destroyed. The entire construction site was being washed away by the force of the water. The protagonist watched in silence, feeling a deep sense of sorrow for what had been lost. The destruction was far greater than they had expected, but the truth was that they had never intended for things to get this out of hand. They just wanted to stop the development, to protect the lake. But now, as the water continued to rise, the protagonist realized that nature had its own way of dealing with things. What they had started could not be controlled anymore. The protagonist knew they had done what they had to do, but that didn't mean they were free from the consequences. They had made a choice, and now they had to live with it. They couldn't change the past, but they hoped that, somehow, the lake would find its way back to the peace it once had. The floodwaters continued to rise, sweeping over the construction site with a force that the protagonist had never anticipated. What had started as a small action, opening the gates of the dam, had quickly turned into something much bigger. As the protagonist stood at the edge of their property, watching the water rise higher and higher, a mixture of emotions flooded over them. There was a sense of satisfaction in knowing that they had disrupted the construction, the cabins, the roads, the parking lots. Everything that threatened to destroy the peace of the lake was now being washed away. But there was also a deep, gnawing sense of guilt. The protagonist had never meant for things to get this out of control. Their goal had been to stop the development, to protect the lake, but now they were witnessing the full force of nature as it took its course. The cabins that had already been built were now half submerged, and the land that had once been a pristine stretch of shoreline was now a muddy, flooded mess. The floodwaters had spread beyond the construction site, creeping into the surrounding forest and over the paths where hikers used to walk. As the protagonist stood there, frozen in place, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. They had stopped the development, yes, but at what cost? The cabins that had been built were no longer just an eyesore. They were now part of the landscape of destruction. The roads that had been carved through the forest were now underwater. The construction equipment, which had once been a symbol of progress, was now stuck in the mud, unable to move. The flood had turned the site into a wasteland, a stark reminder of the chaos the protagonist had unleashed. The protagonist didn't know how much time had passed before they finally moved. The flood had already reached its peak, and the water was beginning to recede, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The cabins that had once been neatly lined up along the shore were now half drowned, their foundations crumbling under the pressure of the rising water. The once clear lake was now filled with debris, broken trees, pieces of construction equipment, and trash that had been carried away by the current. In the quiet aftermath, the protagonist felt the weight of their decision. The damage was done, and there was no going back. They had been so focused on stopping the development that they hadn't fully considered the consequences of their actions. The flood had destroyed more than just the construction site. It had disrupted the delicate balance of nature that had existed for so long. The trees that had been felled to make way for the cabins were now floating in the water, their roots exposed to the elements. The animals that had once called the area home were nowhere to be seen. The lake, which had always been a peaceful refuge, now felt like a broken, polluted mess. The protagonist walked along the shoreline, their boots sinking into the soft, muddy earth. They could still hear the faint sound of water lapping against the banks, but it was no longer the calming sound it had once been. Now, it felt like a reminder of the destruction they had caused. They had acted out of desperation, out of a need to protect the lake, but now they were left with the consequences of their actions. The flood had not just swept away the cabins, it had also taken away the sense of peace that had once existed here. The protagonist could feel the weight of that loss as they continued walking, their eyes scanning the flooded area. The construction workers had long since left, their equipment abandoned and useless in the water. The protagonist knew that the damage was irreversible. The cabins could not be rebuilt, and the construction site would have to be cleared before any work could resume. The HOA would surely have something to say about what had happened, but the protagonist couldn't bring themselves to care. They had done what they felt was necessary, even if it meant losing everything they had fought so hard to protect. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the water, the protagonist sat down on a nearby rock. They had expected to feel victorious, to feel like they had won, but instead they felt hollow, empty. They had stopped the development, but at what cost? The peaceful lake, the very thing they had fought to protect, was now a symbol of destruction. The flood had not just destroyed the cabins, it had also destroyed the dream of a quiet, untouched lake. The protagonist had been so focused on stopping the construction that they hadn't thought about the bigger picture. The damage had been done, and there was no undoing it. The days that followed were filled with confusion and regret. The protagonist tried to reach out to the HOA, but they had already made their feelings known. The organization was furious, and they wasted no time in filing a lawsuit against the protagonist for causing the flood. The news of the flood spread quickly, and soon the community was divided. Some people supported the protagonist's actions, believing that they had done what was necessary to protect the environment. Others, however, saw the protagonist as a troublemaker who had caused unnecessary damage. The media caught wind of the story, and soon the protagonist found themselves in the center of a public storm. The flood had made headlines, and everyone had an opinion on what had happened. Some called the protagonist a hero, while others labeled them as a villain. The protagonist, however, didn't feel like either. They didn't feel like a hero for stopping the construction, and they certainly didn't feel like a villain for causing the flood. They simply felt like someone who had tried to do the right thing, only to find that the consequences were far greater than they had ever imagined. As the lawsuit proceeded, the protagonists spent their days walking around the lake, trying to come to terms with what had happened. The water had receded, but the damage was still evident. The cabins were gone, and the landscape had been forever changed. The trees that had once lined the shore were now submerged, their roots exposed to the air. The protagonist could only watch as the landscape slowly began to recover, knowing that it would never be the same. Despite the damage, there was still hope. The lake, though scarred, would eventually heal. The ecosystem would find its balance again, though it would take time. The protagonist, too, would need time to heal. They had done what they thought was right, but the journey to forgiveness, from both the community and themselves, would be long and difficult. The lake had been their sanctuary, and it had been their fight to protect it. But in the end, the protagonist learned that sometimes, even the best intentions can lead to unintended consequences. As the days passed, the protagonist's world felt increasingly smaller. What had started as a quiet attempt to protect a piece of nature had spiraled into something much bigger, something they couldn't control. The floodwaters had receded, but the consequences of their actions were far from over. What they had done had caught the attention of the entire community, and now the protagonist was living with the fallout. The media buzzed with coverage of the flood. News outlets called it everything from an act of environmental rebellion to a costly mistake. People from all corners of the community seemed to have an opinion, and most of them were not in the protagonist's favor. The once peaceful lake, which had been their sanctuary, was now at the center of a public spectacle. The once crystal-clear water, now muddied and filled with debris, was a constant reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. The HOA, furious and determined to make an example out of the protagonist, had already filed a lawsuit. The lawsuit was aggressive, demanding compensation for the damages to the construction site, the cost of cleaning up the debris, and for the disruption of their development project. To the HOA, it wasn't about the environment anymore. It was about money, loss, and the power they felt they had been denied. But for the protagonist, the legal battle was just one more layer of guilt and regret that weighed them down. When the protagonist looked out over the lake, they saw more than just the flood's aftermath. They saw everything they had worked so hard to protect. The once pristine shorelines were now filled with the remnants of the construction, broken pieces of concrete, half-submerged equipment, and the remains of trees that had been ripped from their roots. The cabins, now abandoned and flooded, looked like forgotten monuments to a failed dream, the dream of preserving the beauty of the lake against all odds. It wasn't just the physical damage that weighed on the protagonist's heart, though. It was the emotional toll. The community was divided. Some people praised the protagonist for standing up against what they saw as corporate greed. They believed that the protagonist had done the right thing, saving the environment from a development that would have destroyed the natural beauty of the area. But others were angry, frustrated, and felt that the protagonist had gone too far. The cabins might have been built on the edge of the lake, but the protagonist's actions had caused far-reaching damage. The flood had destroyed not just the cabins, but the livelihoods of the workers who were building them, the families who had hoped to vacation in them, and the harmony that had once existed in the community. The protagonist didn't know where to turn. The days dragged on, and they felt like an outsider in their own home. Friends who once supported them now whispered behind their backs, unsure of what to make of the situation. The town hall meetings that had once been a place of community gathering now felt like a stage for blame and judgment. Every time the protagonist walked through town, they could feel the eyes of others on them, some filled with admiration, others with resentment. The protagonist had tried to stop a change they felt was wrong, but now they found themselves a prisoner of the very thing they had hoped to protect. The legal proceedings were long and drawn out. The HOA's legal team, a group of sharp professionals, was relentless. The protagonist, with no legal experience, found themselves at a serious disadvantage. The lawsuit dragged on for weeks, and it felt like every new piece of paperwork or every phone call from the lawyer was another weight added to their shoulders. The community watched closely, their opinions divided. Some were hopeful that the protagonist would stand their ground, while others were eager for the situation to come to an end. Throughout all this, the protagonist spent more and more time at the lake. The water was no longer as serene as it had once been. The flood had scarred the landscape, but the protagonist still found solace in the quiet moments. It was as if the lake, despite the destruction, still held a sense of calm. The protagonist would sit by the water, watching as the natural world slowly began to recover. The trees, though damaged, would eventually regrow. The fish, though displaced, would return in time. The lake itself, though changed, was still there, still holding on. And yet, as much as the protagonist wanted to find peace, there was still the weight of their actions to carry. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had been too hasty, too willing to sacrifice everything in the name of a cause they believed in. What had once seemed like a noble act now felt like a mistake. They had been so focused on the development, on stopping it at all costs, that they hadn't fully thought about the consequences. The damage to the cabins, the construction site, and the surrounding land was one thing, but the emotional and social fallout was something the protagonist hadn't expected. The conversations in town had shifted. What was once an issue of preserving nature had become an issue of community values and responsibility. The protagonist had become a symbol, not just of environmental protection, but of defiance. They had taken a stand, and now they were paying the price. The public debates grew louder, with some residents calling for the protagonist to be held accountable for the damage. Others argued that the protagonist had been forced into action because the HOA had ignored the concerns of the community. The debates were endless, and the protagonist felt caught in the middle of it all. The lawsuit was eventually settled, but not in the way the protagonist had hoped. The HOA received a large sum in damages, and the construction project was delayed for months. The cabins, which had once promised economic growth and prosperity, were now at a standstill. The protagonist, though not financially ruined, was left with a sense of deep regret. They had lost their fight to protect the lake, but in doing so, they had lost something far more important, their sense of peace. The flood, once seen as a victory, had turned into a bitter lesson. The protagonist realized that they had acted out of fear, fear of losing something they loved. In the end, they had not just saved the lake, they had destroyed the very thing they had been trying to protect. The flood had washed away the cabins, but it had also washed away their sense of certainty. They had learned, painfully, that sometimes fighting for what we believe in can come with consequences that are far greater than we ever imagined. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the protagonist slowly began to accept the reality of what had happened. The lake would heal, and so would they. The floodwaters had receded, but the lessons of that fateful day would stay with them forever. As time passed, the protagonist found themselves slowly settling into the uneasy reality of what they had done. The months since the flood had been filled with uncertainty, a constant sense of reckoning for the choices they had made. The lake, though scarred, began to show signs of recovery. The water had cleared, and the debris that had been carried by the floodwaters was now nothing more than a memory. The trees, though still damaged, had begun to sprout new leaves, signaling that nature had a way of healing itself, no matter how much humans tried to intervene. But the protagonist knew that healing would take time, both for the environment and for themselves. The legal battle with the HOA had finally come to an end, but the scars from it remained. The protagonist had not been financially ruined, but the emotional toll had been heavy. The settlement had resulted in a significant payout to the HOA, and the construction project was delayed for months. In the end, the cabins that had been built along the shore were abandoned, half-finished and left to decay under the weight of the floodwaters. The HOA, frustrated by the loss, had tried to push for more legal action, but the settlement had marked the end of the battle, at least for now. With the legal drama behind them, the protagonists now faced the long, quiet process of rebuilding their life. The lake, their sanctuary, had been the cause of all the chaos, and it was difficult for them to see it the same way. It had been their haven, their place of peace, but now it was a constant reminder of the destruction they had caused. Still, the protagonists knew that they couldn't let it define them. They couldn't let the flood, the lawsuits, or the judgment of the community be the only thing that shaped their future. There were days when the protagonist would sit by the lake, watching the ripples of water gently flow across the surface. The landscape was scarred, but it was still beautiful. The cabins, once symbols of development, now lay in ruin, and the land that had been altered by construction equipment was slowly regaining its natural form. The protagonist could see the changes, the gradual recovery, and it brought them a small sense of comfort. Nature was resilient, but so was the protagonist. They had learned that the fight for what they believed in wasn't over, even if the immediate battle had been lost. The community, too, had started to heal. The divisions that had formed over the floodwaters were still there, but time had softened the edges. The protagonist's actions had caused a stir, but now, as the months passed, people began to see the bigger picture. Some still viewed the protagonist as a hero, someone who had fought for the environment in the face of corporate greed. Others, however, still blamed the protagonist for the chaos that had followed. The construction site remained abandoned, and the once promised cabins had turned into a symbol of failure. But slowly, people began to realize that it wasn't just about the cabins. It was about the community's relationship with the land, the environment, and the balance between development and preservation. The protagonist, though, wasn't focused on public opinion anymore. They had learned the hard way that sometimes, doing what you think is right can have unintended consequences. It wasn't about being a hero or a villain. It was about doing what felt necessary in the moment, even if it meant sacrificing personal peace. The protagonist had acted out of love for the lake, but they had paid the price for that love. The cabins were gone, the flood had destroyed the development, and the land had been altered forever. But the lake remained, and in that quiet, calm water, the protagonist began to see the first glimpses of healing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the protagonist sat by the lake once again. The world around them was still, the only sound coming from the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. The water was calm, reflecting the colors of the setting sun, and for a moment it felt like everything was right again. The protagonist closed their eyes, taking in the fresh, cool air, and allowed themselves to just be present. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, seemed distant. The future, with all its unknowns, seemed less overwhelming. The protagonist realized then that the lake would never be the same. It would never be the peaceful retreat it once was, free from disruption or change. But maybe that was okay. The lake had been a place of comfort for the protagonist, but it was also a reminder that nothing in life stays the same. Change, both good and bad, was inevitable. What mattered was how one responded to it. The protagonist had responded to the destruction of their land with a choice that had led to unintended consequences, but also had taught them valuable lessons. They had acted out of love and fear, but now they had the chance to rebuild both the land and themselves. Over time, the protagonist began to connect with the community again. The lawsuit had long been settled, and though the scars of the past still lingered, the protagonist knew that moving forward meant accepting the consequences of their actions. They started to volunteer with local environmental groups, helping to restore the land around the lake. They worked with others to plant trees, clear away debris, and restore the shoreline to something that resembled the peace it once had. It wasn't the same as before, but it was still beautiful. The protagonist found solace in the work, in the small steps that were being taken to bring the land back to life. The community, too, started to change. People who had once been divided over the protagonist's actions began to see the long-term effects of preserving nature. The conversation shifted from blame to understanding, and the protagonist found that, slowly but surely, people were willing to listen to what they had to say about the environment and the need for balance. The floodwaters had washed away more than just the cabins. They had washed away the old way of thinking and opened the door to a new understanding. Looking back, the protagonist knew that their actions would be remembered for a long time. They had disrupted a development that would have forever changed the landscape, but they had also caused damage, both to the environment and to their community. They had acted with passion, but they had learned that passion alone wasn't enough. The world wasn't as simple as right or wrong, good or bad. It was messy, full of complexity and nuance, and the protagonist had learned that the hard way. But they also knew that they had tried. They had fought for something they believed in, even if it had cost them dearly. The lake, though changed, was still there. And in that quiet, healing water, the protagonist had found a sense of peace, not just with the land, but with themselves. They had learned that sometimes the road to redemption was long and winding, but it was worth traveling step by step.